In the harsh Montana territory of 1867, a lonely giant of a man approached the territory's most talked-about woman with a declaration that would scandalize the frontier town. "I'll make you pregnant, Magdalena Hayes." But when bullets start flying, and their unlikely bond is tested by vengeful neighbors and a society that judges them both, will Magnus Ironwood's blunt promise prove to be the salvation they both desperately need? The sound of breaking glass shattered the Montana morning silence. Magdalena Hayes dropped her coffee cup as she watched a man bigger than any giant from fairy tales crash through her neighbor's fence. His horse bucked and kicked, but the massive rider stayed in his saddle like he was born there. September sun beat down on Thunder Creek in 1867, making the air shimmer like water. Magdalena wiped sweat from her forehead and squinted across the valley. The giant man had no shirt on, showing muscles that looked carved from mountain stone. His skin was bronze from working outdoors, and scars crossed his chest like a map of old battles. "Well, I'll be," she whispered to herself. Her cattle lifted their heads to stare at the commotion. Magdalena's prize bull, Caesar, snorted and pawed the ground. Even her animals seemed impressed by this stranger who rode like thunder itself. The man finally got his horse under control. He sat tall in his saddle, looking around the valley like he was seeing it for the first time. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and sharp as ice. When those eyes found Magdalena standing by her cabin, they stopped moving. For 32 years, Magdalena had lived in this valley. She knew every rock, every tree, every bend in Thunder Creek. But this man was something new, something that made her heart beat faster and her mouth go dry. She smoothed down her work dress, suddenly aware of how she looked. The other women in town were small and delicate, like china dolls. Magdalena was built strong and solid, like the mountains around them. Her father used to say she was made for frontier life, not parlor sitting. The stranger dismounted and began walking toward her property line. Each step covered more ground than most men could manage in two. His boots were worn but well made, and his pants were the kind cowhands wore when they had money to spend. Magdalena's mare, Buttercup, nickered softly from the corral. The sound seemed to break some kind of spell. The giant man stopped walking and tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear. "Morning, miss." His voice carried across the distance between them like rolling thunder before a storm. Magdalena's neighbor, old Pete Wilson, came running out of his cabin. Pete was skinny as a fence post and twice as weathered. He looked back and forth between his broken fence and the giant man like he couldn't decide which problem was bigger. "Magnus, you fool horse threw you right through my best wood," Pete hollered. But he didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man trying not to laugh. So the giant had a name, Magnus. It fit him like his worn leather boots fit his feet, perfectly and without question. "I'll fix it," Magnus called back, but his eyes never left Magdalena. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. Men didn't usually stare at her, except to whisper behind their hands about Fat Maggie Hayes and her failing ranch. Those whispers followed her everywhere, to church, to the general store, even to her own mailbox. But Magnus wasn't whispering. He was looking at her like she was worth looking at. Pete Wilson scratched his gray head. "Magnus here just started working for me 3 months back. Best hand I've ever had. But that horse of his has a mind of its own." 3 months, Magdalena repeated. Had this man been living so close without her knowing? She spent every day working her land, watching her cattle, mending her fences. How had she missed someone so impossible to miss? Magnus walked closer to the property line that separated her land from Pete's. Up close, he was even more impressive. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the world, and his hands looked like they could shape iron with their bare strength. "Been watching your operation," he said simply. "You run good cattle." Pride swelled in Magdalena's chest. Her father had started this ranch 20 years ago, with nothing but determination and a handful of stubborn cows. She'd been working beside him since she was 12, learning every aspect of ranch life. After he died 5 years ago, she'd kept it running alone. "Thank you," she managed to say. Takes skill to keep stock healthy through Montana winters. Magnus stepped closer to her fence line. Takes more skill to do it alone. The way he said alone made something twist in Magdalena's stomach. She was alone, had been for years. The townspeople made sure she knew it. Every time they asked when she was going to find a husband or sell the ranch to someone who could properly manage it. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, crying out as it hunted. The sound made both Magdalena and Magnus look up at the same time. When their eyes met again, something passed between them. A recognition, maybe, or a question that hadn't been asked yet. Storm coming, Magnus observed, nodding toward dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. Magdalena glanced at the sky. She'd been so focused on this strange encounter that she'd missed the changing weather. Years of ranch life had taught her to read the signs, the way the wind shifted, how the animals moved, the smell of rain in the air. Should hit by evening, she agreed. Your stock got good shelter? The question surprised her. Most men assumed she didn't know how to care for her own animals. North Pasture has a good windbreak. Creek runs year-round for water. Magnus nodded approvingly. Smart placement. Pete Wilson had been watching this exchange like it was a show put on for his entertainment. Now he cleared his throat loudly. Well, I suppose introductions are in order. Magnus Ironwood. Meet Magdalena Hayes. Maggie, this is the fellow I told you about. The one who helped me round up those strays last month. So Pete had mentioned him. Magdalena tried to remember the conversation, but all she recalled was Pete saying something about a good worker with a mysterious past. Half the men in Montana Territory had mysterious pasts, so she hadn't paid much attention. Miss Hayes. Magnus touched the brim of his hat politely. Mr. Ironwood. She managed to keep her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the storm was still hours away. Or maybe that was just the sound of Magnus's voice echoing in her memory. Magnus Ironwood had been planning this moment for 3 months, but now that it was here, words seemed as slippery as creek stones. He'd watched Magdalena Hayes work her land every morning, admiring the way she handled her horses and the gentle patience she showed with difficult cattle. Mr. Wilson, Magnus said, never taking his eyes off Magdalena. Could I trouble you for a private word with Miss Hayes? Pete's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared under his hat. In all his 70 years, he'd never heard a man ask permission to court a woman quite so formally, especially not while standing in the wreckage of a broken fence. Well, I suppose that's up to the lady, Pete said, grinning like he'd just discovered gold in his creek. Magdalena felt her stomach flip over. Private conversations with strange men weren't exactly proper, but then again, nothing about frontier life followed parlor rules. I suppose a few minutes wouldn't hurt. Pete headed back toward his cabin, chuckling to himself. I'll be fixing that fence, he called over his shoulder. Take your time getting acquainted. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. Magnus studied Magdalena's face, noting the intelligence in her brown eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. This was a woman who'd faced down rustlers, survived harsh winters, and built something lasting with her own 2 hands. You've been watching me work, Magdalena said. It wasn't a question. Every morning for 3 months, Magnus admitted. The way you handle your stock impressed me. The way you sit a horse. The way you don't quit when things get difficult. Heat crept up Magdalena's neck. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from men who looked like they could wrestle bears for entertainment. Ranching's not easy work. No, it isn't. Magnus stepped closer to her fence. Takes a special kind of person to make it work. Takes strength most people don't have. The way he said strength made it sound like a precious thing instead of something to be ashamed of. All her life, people had made Magdalena feel like her size was a problem to be solved. Too big for dresses, too heavy for delicate work, too much woman for any man to want. But Magnus was looking at her like she was exactly right. What do you want, Mr. Ironwood? The question came out sharper than she intended. Magnus was quiet for a long moment, watching the clouds build in the western sky. When he spoke, his words hit her like a physical blow. I want to marry you, Magdalena Hayes. I want to work this land beside you and raise children who'll be as strong as this country demands. I'll make you pregnant, and our babies will be tough enough to survive anything Montana can throw at them. Magdalena's mouth fell open. In all her years of dreaming about marriage proposals, she'd never imagined anything quite so direct. No pretty speeches about love at first sight or flowery promises about devotion. Just a statement of intent, as raw and honest as the frontier itself. That's quite an assumption, she managed to say, though her voice shook like leaves in wind. Is it? Magnus studied her face carefully. You're 32, unmarried, running a successful ranch alone. Every man in the territory either ignores you or treats you like you're invisible. But you're not invisible to me. The truth of his words stung worse than a hornet. Maybe there's a reason for that. There is. They're fools. Such simple words, but they hit Magdalena right in the heart. She'd spent so many years believing the whispers, accepting that she was too much, too big, too independent, too difficult for any decent man to want. You don't know me, she protested weakly. I know enough. Magnus leaned against her fence post, making the whole structure creak under his weight. I know you sing to your horses when you think nobody's listening. I know you give your leftover bread to Widow Peterson's children every time you go to town. I know you worked through that blizzard last February when your hands quit, and you didn't lose a single head of cattle. Each observation felt like a gentle touch. Someone had been watching her, really watching, and seeing things worth remembering. How do you know about the Peterson children? She asked. I was in Wilson's store when you thought nobody was looking. You slipped that bread into little Emma's basket like it was the most natural thing in the world. Magdalena remembered that day. Emma Peterson had been staring at the penny candy with hungry eyes while her mother counted and recounted their meager coins. The fresh bread in Magdalena's basket had seemed like too much for one person anyway. That doesn't mean anything special, she said. It means you have a good heart. It means you understand what it feels like to be hungry. Maybe not for food, but for something. Magnus's pale eyes held her steadily. I've been hungry too, Magdalena. Hungry for something real. A meadowlark sang from a nearby fence post, its clear notes cutting through the tension. Magdalena found herself thinking about her mother's words before she died. Don't settle for a man who wants to make you smaller, Maggie. Wait for one who sees how much room you need to grow. This is crazy, she whispered. Maybe, but crazy's not always wrong. Magnus straightened to his full height, towering over her, even with the fence between them. I'm not offering you poetry or pretty lies. I'm offering you partnership, a life built on truth instead of pretending. The storm clouds were closer now, casting shadows across the valley. Magdalena could smell rain on the wind, that clean scent that promised change. I don't even know where you come from, she said. Pennsylvania. Worked my family's farm until the war came. Fought with the Union Army. Learned things about killing I wish I could forget. Came west afterward, because I needed somewhere big enough to hold all the quiet I was looking for. There was pain in his voice when he mentioned the war. Magdalena had seen enough soldiers pass through Montana to recognize that particular kind of hurt, the kind that lived behind a man's eyes and never quite healed. Why me? She asked. There are plenty of unmarried women in Crow's Hollow. Prettier ones, smaller ones. Magnus was quiet for so long that Magdalena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were soft as summer rain. Because when I watch you work, I see someone who belongs to this land, the way mountains belong to the sky. Because you're not afraid of hard things, or big spaces, or your own strength. He paused, studying her face. And because when you smile, really smile, not that polite thing you do in town, it's like watching sunrise over the Rockies. Magdalena felt tears prick her eyes. Nobody had ever talked about her smile like it was something worth seeing. Thunder rolled across the valley, closer now. The first drops of rain began to fall, spattering in the dust at their feet. "Think about it," Magnus said, stepping back from the fence. "But don't think too long. Good things don't wait forever, and neither do I." He turned and walked back toward Pete's cabin, leaving Magdalena standing alone in the gathering storm, with her heart pounding and her world turned upside down. As the rain began in earnest, she touched the wooden locket at her throat, her mother's final gift, and felt it warm against her palm, like it held secrets, waiting to be revealed. The thunder crashed so loud, it made the cabin windows shake. Magdalena jumped up from her kitchen table, where she'd been staring at cold beans for the past hour. Her heart was still racing from what Magnus had said that morning. No man had ever spoken to her like that before. She walked to her bedroom and looked in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The woman looking back had brown hair, tied in a messy bun, and dirt under her fingernails from morning chores. Her dress was too tight around the middle, and she could see the worry lines around her green eyes. "Mama, what would you do?" she whispered to the empty room. The wooden locket around her neck felt warm against her skin. Her mother had given it to her before dying of fever 5 years ago. Inside was a tiny picture of her parents on their wedding day. Her mama had been a big woman too, but her papa had looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world. Lightning lit up the sky again, and Magdalena saw a rider coming fast toward her cabin. It was Magnus, hunched over his horse as rain poured down on his bare back. He looked like some wild creature from the mountains. She opened the door before he could knock. Water dripped from his dark hair, and his pale eyes looked worried. "Miss Hayes, you need to pack your things. Now." "What? Why?" "The Garrett boys are coming. Tonight. I heard them talking at the saloon in town." Magnus stepped inside, leaving muddy footprints on her clean floor. "They're planning to burn you out. Take your land while you can't fight back." Magdalena's stomach dropped. Old man Garrett had been trying to buy her ranch for months. He wanted the creek that ran through her property. Without it, his cattle would die in the dry season. "How do you know this?" "I was having a drink when Silas started bragging. Said his daddy was tired of waiting for you to sell." Magnus grabbed her shoulders with his big hands. "They think you're alone and helpless. I am alone." The words came out smaller than she meant them to. "No, you're not." Something in his voice made her look up at him. His eyes were serious, like he was making her a promise without saying the words. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked. Magnus was quiet for a long moment. Rain drummed on the roof above them. Finally, he said, "Because I meant what I said this morning. Every word of it." Heat spread through her chest. No one had ever wanted to protect her before. Her papa had died when she was 25, and since then, she'd been fighting this ranch alone. The townspeople whispered about poor fat Maggie when they thought she couldn't hear. "They'll be here in an hour," Magnus said. "Maybe less." Magdalena thought about running. She could pack her few belongings and ride to her cousin's place in Wyoming. Start over somewhere new, where people didn't know her story. But then she looked around her cabin. Her father had built it with his own hands. Her mother had died in the bedroom down the hall. Every board and nail held memories of the only family she'd ever known. "No," she said firmly. "I won't run." "Magdalena, there are 5 of them. You can't. This is my home." She walked to the gun cabinet and pulled out her father's old rifle. "If they want it, they'll have to take it over my dead body." Magnus watched her check the gun's loading with steady hands. Something changed in his expression. The worry was still there, but now there was something else. Respect, maybe. Or admiration. "You know how to use that thing?" "Papa taught me to hunt when I was 12. I can hit a rabbit at 50 yards. She looked at him directly. "Can you fight?" A grim smile crossed his face. "I fought in the war. Lost my whole unit at Bull Run. But I kept fighting. Learned some things about staying alive when the odds are bad." "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that keep good people breathing and send bad people running." He moved to the window and peered out into the storm. "They'll come from 3 directions. Try to surround the cabin so you can't escape." Magdalena felt her hands shaking. But not from fear, from anger. These men thought they could just take what wasn't theirs, because she was a woman alone. They thought her size made her weak instead of strong. What do? We make them wish they'd stayed home tonight. Magnus started moving around her cabin like he'd been planning this for weeks. He pushed her heavy kitchen table against the front door and told her to put out all the lamps except one small candle. They'll expect you to be scared and hiding, he explained. Instead, we're going to be ready for them. As they worked together to prepare for the fight, Magdalena found herself stealing glances at this strange man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she'd never dared to pray. His movements were quick and sure, like a predator getting ready to hunt. Magnus? Yeah? What you said this morning about making me pregnant. Did you mean it? Or were you just trying to shock me? He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her completely. I don't say things I don't mean, Magdalena. Life's too short for lying. But you don't even know me. I know enough. He walked closer until she could smell the rain and leather on his skin. I know you get up before dawn to check on your cattle. I know you sing to your horses when you think no one's listening. I know you give your extra bread to the Peterson children when you go to town. Magdalena's breath caught. You've been watching me. For 3 months now. Every morning, I see you out there working, never complaining, never giving up, even when the whole town treats you like you don't matter. His voice got softer. But you do matter. More than you know. Before she could respond, they heard horses splashing through the mud outside. Magnus held up his hand for silence and moved to the window again. 5 riders, just like I thought, he whispered. They're spreading out around the cabin. Magdalena's heart was pounding so hard she was sure the men outside could hear it. She gripped her rifle tighter and tried to remember everything her father had taught her about shooting. Magdalena Hayes, Silas Garrett's voice cut through the storm. Come on out. We just want to talk. She looked at Magnus, who shook his head firmly. We know you're in there, another voice called. This one sounded like Billy Garrett, Silas's younger brother. Make this easy on yourself. Magnus moved to her side and spoke quietly in her ear. When the shooting starts, stay low and aim for center mass. Don't try to be fancy, just point and shoot. I've never shot at a person before. They're not people tonight. They're wolves, trying to take what's yours. His hand covered hers on the rifle stock. You can do this, Magdalena. You're stronger than you know. The cabin suddenly got very quiet, except for the rain. Even the thunder seemed to pause, like the whole world was holding its breath. Then glass shattered as someone threw a rock through her kitchen window. Fire exploded across Magdalena's kitchen as a burning torch sailed through the broken window. The flames caught her curtains and started climbing toward the wooden ceiling. Smoke filled the small cabin in seconds. They're not playing games, Magnus growled, grabbing a bucket of water to throw on the flames. More glass broke in the back bedroom. Another torch, then another through the side window. The Garrett boys were trying to burn them out from every direction at once. Magdalena, last chance, Silas shouted from somewhere in the darkness outside. Come out and we'll let you ride away. She raised her rifle toward the front window where she could see moving shadows. Go to hell, Silas! A bullet smashed through the wood next to her head, sending splinters flying. Magnus grabbed her and pulled her down behind the overturned table just as more shots rang out. They're shooting to kill now, he said grimly. No more talking. The cabin was getting hotter as the fire spread. Smoke burned her eyes and made it hard to breathe. Through the chaos, she could hear men moving around outside, their boots splashing through puddles as they got into position. Magnus crawled to the front window and fired his big pistol 3 times fast. Someone outside screamed in pain. Got one, he called back to her. But Magdalena was watching the back door. She could see a shadow moving there, trying to get in quietly, while they were distracted by the shooting out front. She aimed her rifle at the door and waited. Her hands were steady now. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something harder, something that had been building up for years of being pushed around and looked down on. The door creaked open slowly. Billy Garrett's face appeared, pale in the firelight. He had his gun ready, and was looking toward where Magnus was shooting. Magdalena pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, but her shot was true. Billy spun around and fell backward out the door, grabbing his arm and cursing loudly. "Nice shooting," Magnus said with approval, "but we can't stay in here much longer. The whole place is going to come down." He was right. The fires were spreading faster than they could put them out. Soon the roof would catch, and then they'd be trapped. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen," Magdalena said. "Papa dug it to store vegetables. It has another way out behind the cabin. Show me." She crawled across the hot floor to where a wooden trapdoor was hidden under a rug. Magnus helped her pull it open, revealing a narrow ladder going down into darkness. "You go first," he said. "I'll cover you. What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. But if something happens to me, you keep going. Get to the back exit and ride for town. Tell the sheriff what happened here." Magdalena wanted to argue, but another window exploded inward as more burning wood flew in. The cabin was becoming an oven. She climbed down the ladder into the cool, damp cellar. The space was small and cramped, filled with barrels of stored food and tools. At the far end, she could see another ladder leading up to what looked like a wooden door in the ceiling. Magnus dropped down behind her, moving fast despite his size. Above them, the cabin groaned and cracked as the fire ate through the support beams. "They'll figure out we're not in there soon enough," he said, checking his pistol. "We need to move." They crawled through the narrow space toward the back exit. Magdalena's dress caught on a nail and tore, but she didn't care. All she wanted was to get out of this trap alive. As they reached the other ladder, they could hear voices outside. The Garrett boys were getting confused, wondering why no one was shooting back anymore. "Where are they?" one voice called. "Maybe they're already dead," another answered. Magnus climbed up first and pushed carefully against the wooden door. It opened into the storm, revealing a small area behind the cabin where her vegetable garden used to be. He helped Magdalena up, and they crouched together in the mud, trying to see through the rain and darkness. The burning cabin lit everything with an angry orange glow, but it also made it hard to see past the light. "There," Magnus whispered, pointing toward the barn where their horses were kept. "We can make it if we're fast." They ran together across the open ground, expecting bullets to start flying at any second. But the Garrett boys were all focused on the front of the cabin, waiting for them to come out shooting. They made it to the barn safely. Magdalena's horse, a sturdy mare named Honey, whinnied nervously at the smell of smoke. Magnus's big stallion was already saddled, like he'd been planning for a quick escape all along. "Smart thinking," she said, impressed despite everything. "I was a cavalry scout during the war. Always keep your horse ready to run." He helped her saddle Honey with quick, efficient movements. "Question is, where do we run to?" Magdalena thought about it as she tightened the saddle straps. They could ride to town, but that was 15 miles through rough country in a storm. The sheriff might not even believe their story. Old man Garrett had friends in town, people who owed him money or favors. "My neighbor to the north, Martha Peterson. She's a widow with 3 kids, but her late husband left her some good men who work the ranch. They'd help us." "How far?" 5 miles through the creek bottom. "Rough riding, but we can make it." A loud crash came from behind them as part of her cabin's roof collapsed. The fire was spreading to the barn now, and she could see sparks landing on the dry hay. "We need to go," Magnus said urgently. "Right now." They led their horses out the back of the barn just as Silas Garrett's voice rang out from the front of the cabin. "They're not in there. Start looking around." Magnus helped Magdalena onto her horse, his big hands steady and sure even in the chaos. For a moment, their eyes met in the firelight, and she saw something there that made her heart skip. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, gripping the reins tightly. "Let's ride." They kicked their horses into a gallop just as the first shouts came from behind them. The Garrett boys had found the empty barn and realized their prey had escaped. Gunshots echoed through the storm as they rode hard toward the creek, but the bullets went wide in the darkness and rain. Magdalena leaned low over Honey's neck. feeling the mare's powerful muscles bunch and stretch as they ran for their lives. Behind them, her cabin burned like a funeral pyre, taking with it everything she'd ever owned except the clothes on her back and the locket around her neck. But somehow, riding through the storm with Magnus beside her, she didn't feel like she'd lost everything. She felt like her real life was just beginning. Magnus grabbed Silas Garrett by the throat and slammed him against the cabin wall. The sound echoed across the valley like a gunshot. Blood dripped from a cut above Magnus's left eye, but his grip never loosened. "You made a big mistake coming here tonight," Magnus growled, his voice low and dangerous. Magdalena watched from the doorway, her father's rifle still smoking in her hands. The other Garrett boys lay sprawled in her yard, two groaning, one silent, one crawling toward his horse. She had never seen violence like this before. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Let me go," Silas wheezed, clawing at Magnus's massive hand. "Not until you listen real good." Magnus pressed harder. "This woman is under my protection now. You come near her again and I'll bury you where the wolves can't find you." Silas's face turned purple. Magnus released him, and the smaller man collapsed to his knees, gasping. Blood ran from his nose onto the wooden porch. "You can't protect her forever," Silas spat between breaths. Magnus picked up his cavalry saber from where he'd dropped it. The blade caught the moonlight. "Want to test that theory right now?" Silas scrambled backward, fear replacing the anger in his eyes. "This ain't over, Ironwood. My pa owns half this territory. He'll have the law on you." "Your pa's a coward who sends his sons to do his dirty work," Magdalena said, stepping forward. "Just like you." The wounded Garrett boy by the horses managed to pull himself up. "Come on, Silas, let's get out of here." Silas stood slowly, wiping blood from his mouth. His eyes moved between Magnus and Magdalena. "You think you won something here? Wait until winter comes. Wait until your cattle start dying. We'll see how tough you are then." "Get off my land," Magdalena said quietly. After the Garretts limped away into the darkness, Magnus turned to examine Magdalena's wounded arm. A bullet had grazed her just above the elbow. Blood soaked through her torn sleeve. "Sit down," he said, guiding her to a chair. "Let me look at that." His hands were gentle despite their size. He tore strips from a clean dish towel and began wrapping her arm. Magdalena watched his face as he worked. Up close, she could see more scars than she'd noticed before. A jagged line ran from his left ear to his jaw. Another crossed his forehead. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" she asked. "Army. Spent 3 years fighting Confederates down in Texas." His fingers worked quickly, tying off the bandage. "Learned real quick that hesitation gets you killed." "Is that why you came to Montana? Running from the war?" Magnus paused in his work. Running towards something, maybe. Not away from it. The cabin felt different now, with the door hanging broken on its hinges. Colder. More exposed. Magdalena shivered, though the night wasn't particularly cold. "They'll be back," she said. "Maybe, but not tonight." Magnus stood and moved to the window. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" He turned to face her. "You've got choices, Magdalena. You can run. Sell this place and move back east where it's safe. Or you can fight. I'm not running anywhere. This is my home. Then you need to understand what that means." Magnus sat down across from her. "Fighting the Garretts isn't like shooing away coyotes. They've got money, connections, and they don't give up easy. If you stay, it's going to get worse before it gets better." Magdalena looked around her cabin, at the broken door, the overturned table, the bullet hole in her wall. Everything her father had built, everything she'd worked to keep. The thought of losing it made her stomach sick. "What about you?" she asked. "Why did you help me tonight? You barely know me." Magnus was quiet for a long moment. Outside, an owl hooted in the distance. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said finally. "I know what it's like to have everyone expect you to fail." "People expect you to fail?" "People look at me and see a freak. Too big, Too strange, too dangerous. Been that way since I was 12 years old, and already taller than grown men. He flexed his scarred hands. After the war, I tried settling in different places. Never worked out. People got nervous having me around. Magdalena studied his face in the lamplight. Is that why you came here? To my ranch, I mean. I came here because I watched you for 3 months, and never once saw you back down from anything. Not the weather. Not difficult cattle. Not the men in town who whisper behind your back. Magnus leaned forward. I came here because I recognized something in you. What? Strength. Real strength. The kind that doesn't break under pressure. Heat rose in Magdalena's cheeks. No one had ever called her strong before. Fat? Yes. Stubborn? Certainly. But never strong. I still don't understand what you want from me, she said. Magnus stood and walked to the broken door. He lifted it back into place, testing the damaged hinges. I want to stop being alone, he said without looking at her. And I think maybe you do too. The simple honesty of it hit her harder than any of Silas Garrett's threats. She had been alone for so long, since her father's death 2 years ago. Really, since her mother had died when she was 16. Alone with her cattle and her failing ranch, and the weight of everyone's low expectations. What are you proposing exactly? She asked. Magnus turned around. Partnership. I work your ranch, help you fight off the Garretts, share the risks and the profits. In return, you give me a home and a reason to stay in one place. And the other part? What you said this morning about making me pregnant? Magnus's pale eyes met hers directly. That's up to you. I won't force anything you don't want, but I won't pretend I don't want it either. The air between them seemed to thicken. Magdalena found it hard to breathe normally. I need time to think. Take all the time you need, but decide quick. Winter's coming, and the Garretts won't wait for spring to make their next move. 3 days later, Magdalena stood at her kitchen window, watching Magnus repair her barn roof. The morning sun highlighted every muscle in his back as he hammered new boards into place. He'd been working since dawn, and she'd been watching him for most of that time. She'd barely slept since the attack. Every sound outside made her reach for her rifle. Every shadow looked like it might hide a Garrett boy with a grudge, but Magnus's presence made the fear manageable somehow. Stop staring and go talk to him, she whispered to herself. She'd made her decision during the long, sleepless hours of the previous night. Now, she just had to find the courage to say it out loud. The wooden locket her mother had left her felt warm against her throat as she walked across the yard. She'd noticed it getting warmer ever since Magnus had first spoken to her, but she'd told herself it was just her imagination. You're up early, Magnus called down from the roof. Couldn't sleep much. Magdalena shaded her eyes with her hand. Can you come down? I need to talk to you. Magnus climbed down the ladder with surprising grace for such a big man. His shirt hung open in the morning heat, and Magdalena found herself staring again. She'd never seen a man built like him. All muscle and scars and barely contained power. Coffee's ready, she said, stepping back toward the cabin. We should talk inside. They sat at her small kitchen table with steaming cups between them. Magnus waited patiently while Magdalena gathered her thoughts. She'd practiced this conversation a dozen times, but now that the moment had come, the words felt stuck in her throat. I've been thinking about your offer, she said finally, and I want to say yes, to the partnership part anyway. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup for warmth. But I need to know more about you first. About your plans, your past. What you really want from this arrangement. Magnus nodded slowly. Fair enough. What do you want to know? Start with why you really came to Montana. The whole truth this time. Magnus was quiet for so long that Magdalena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more uncertain than she'd ever heard it. I came here to disappear, he said. After the war ended, I tried going back to my family's farm in Ohio, but my parents were dead. My brother had sold the land, and the whole town looked at me like I was some kind of dangerous animal they couldn't quite trust. Because of your size? because of what I'd become. Magnus rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. I learned to kill during the war, Magdalena. Learned to enjoy it, maybe. That changes a man. The admission hung in the air between them. Magdalena thought about the violence she'd witnessed 3 nights ago. How quickly and efficiently Magnus had dealt with the Garrett boys. Are you telling me I should be afraid of you? She asked. I'm telling you the truth. What you do with it is up to you. Magdalena studied his face, the hard lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the careful way he held himself, even sitting at her kitchen table. Have you ever hurt anyone who didn't deserve it? No. Do you plan to? No. Then I'm not afraid of you. The words surprised her with their certainty. What else? Magnus seemed to relax slightly. I've got money saved from my army pay, enough to buy cattle, improve this place, maybe build a proper house if you're willing. Where would we live while we're building? I could sleep in the barn until... No. Magdalena felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, if we're going to be partners, real partners, then we should. That is, I think you should. Magnus leaned forward slightly. What are you trying to say, Magdalena? She took a deep breath and met his eyes. I'm saying yes to all of it. The partnership, the shared home, the other part too. For a moment, Magnus looked stunned. Are you sure? Because once we start down this path, I'm sure. Magdalena reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were twice the size of hers, scarred and calloused from hard work. I've spent 2 years trying to run this place alone, and I'm failing. I've spent my whole life listening to people tell me I'm too big, too difficult, too much trouble for any decent man to want. You're not too much of anything. Then prove it. The words came out bolder than she'd intended. Show me what it's like to be wanted instead of just tolerated. Magnus stood slowly, still holding her hand. He pulled her up from her chair and into his arms. This close, she could smell leather and sawdust and something else, something purely male that made her stomach flutter. You sure about this? He asked one more time. Instead of answering with words, Magdalena rose on her toes and kissed him. It was clumsy at first. She had little experience with kissing, but Magnus was patient, gentle, letting her set the pace. When they broke apart, Magdalena was breathing hard. I want to show you something, she said. She led him to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. From around her neck, she lifted the wooden locket and opened it. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents on their wedding day, and beneath that, a folded piece of paper. What is it? Magnus asked, sitting beside her. A letter from my mother. She wrote it before she died. Told me to read it when I found the man I wanted to marry. Magdalena's hands shook slightly as she unfolded the yellowed paper. She said the locket would know when I'd found the right person, that it would feel warm when true love touched it. And Magdalena pressed the locket into his palm. What do you feel? Magnus closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, wonder filled his expression. It's warm. Hot. Almost. It's been that way since the first morning you spoke to me. Magdalena took the locket back and fastened it around her neck again. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I can't ignore it anymore. Magnus cupped her face in his hands. What did the letter say? Magdalena smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. That love isn't about being small enough for someone else's comfort. It's about finding someone strong enough to match your own heart. When Magnus kissed her this time, it tasted like promises and possibility and the wild freedom of the Montana wind. And for the first time in her life, Magdalena Hayes felt like she was exactly the right size for the love she'd found. The screaming started at midnight, and Magnus knew their baby was coming whether they were ready or not. Magdalena gripped his hand so tight her nails drew blood. But he didn't pull away. Outside their cabin, the worst blizzard in 20 years howled like angry spirits, and the nearest doctor was 40 miles away in Crow's Hollow. I can't do this, Magdalena gasped between pains. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold air seeping through the cabin walls. "Something's wrong, Magnus. This isn't how it's supposed to feel." Magnus had delivered foals and calves, but never a human baby. His massive hands shook as he heated water on the stove. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, making everything look bigger and scarier than it really was. He'd faced Confederate soldiers and wild bears, but nothing had ever terrified him like watching his wife suffer. "Martha Peterson delivered 6 babies," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She told me what to do if this happened. But Martha lived 15 miles away, and the snow outside was already 3 feet deep. Their horses couldn't make it through drifts that high, not in this wind. They were completely alone." Magdalena's next scream cut through the storm noise. Magnus dropped the pot of water, sending steam hissing across the wooden floor. When he turned back to their bed, he saw something that made his blood freeze. There was too much blood on the sheets, way more than Martha had said was normal. "Magnus," Magdalena whispered, her face pale as moonlight, "if something happens to me, you have to promise me something." "Nothing's going to happen," but his voice cracked when he said it. "Promise me you'll find someone else to love. Promise me you won't spend your whole life alone on this ranch, talking to ghosts." Magnus knelt beside the bed and took her bloody hand in both of his. "The only promise I'm making is that we're both going to survive this night. You, me, and our baby." Another pain hit her, stronger than before. This time, she didn't scream. She bit down on the leather belt Magnus gave her, and pushed with everything she had. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Magnus wiped her face with cool cloths, and whispered stories about the life they'd build together. He told her about the new barn they'd construct in spring, about the vegetable garden she wanted to plant, about teaching their child to ride and rope and read. Just when Magnus thought they might lose the battle, something changed. Magdalena's breathing evened out, and her grip on his hand grew stronger instead of weaker. "I can feel the baby moving down," she panted. I think it's working now." The next hour passed in a blur of instructions Magnus barely understood. He'd never felt so helpless or so important at the same time. When their daughter finally slipped into the world, she was blue and silent, and Magnus's heart stopped beating. "Why isn't she crying?" Magdalena struggled to sit up. "Magnus, why isn't our baby crying?" Magnus lifted the tiny girl and rubbed her back the way he'd seen Martha do with newborn calves. Nothing happened. He tried again, harder this time, and suddenly the most beautiful sound in the world filled their cabin. Their daughter's first cry was loud and strong and absolutely perfect. "Let me see her," Magdalena sobbed, reaching out with trembling arms. "Let me hold my baby." As Magnus placed their daughter against Magdalena's chest, the storm outside began to calm. The wind stopped howling, and fat snowflakes drifted past their window like falling stars. Their baby girl had dark hair like her mother and pale blue eyes like her father. She weighed barely 5 pounds, but she gripped Magnus's finger with surprising strength. "What should we name her?" Magnus asked, his voice hoarse from 12 hours of fear and worry. Magdalena studied their daughter's tiny face. "Hope. Her name is Hope, because she came to us in the darkest hour and made everything bright again." Magnus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd made a lot of promises in his 35 years, but none had mattered as much as the one he'd made to Magdalena about surviving this night. They'd kept their word to each other, and now they had living proof that some promises were worth bleeding for. 3 days later, the snow had melted enough for Martha Peterson to ride over and check on them. She found Magnus chopping wood outside while Magdalena nursed Hope by the fire inside. Both parents looked exhausted but happy, like people who'd fought a war and won. "You did good, Magnus," Martha said, examining the baby with experienced hands. "This little girl is healthy as a horse, and Magdalena's healing up just fine." "I was so scared," Magnus admitted, setting down his axe. "I thought I might lose them both." Martha patted his arm. "Fear means you care, and caring means you'll do whatever it takes to protect what matters most." That night, as Magnus watched his wife and daughter sleep, he understood something he'd never grasped before. Love wasn't just about making promises, it was about keeping them, even when keeping them seemed impossible. Outside, spring was coming to Montana. The ice on Thunder Creek was starting to break up, sending chunks of winter floating downstream toward new adventures. Inside their warm cabin, Magnus Ironwood held his family and knew that every hard choice he'd ever made had led him exactly where he belonged. 2 years had passed since that terrible, wonderful night when hope came into the world, and Magnus stood watching his daughter take her first real steps across the front porch. She wobbled like a drunken cowhand, but kept trying anyway, her mother's stubborn streak already showing in every determined stumble. "She's going to be walking everywhere soon," Magdalena laughed, catching Hope before she tumbled off the porch edge. "We'll never keep up with her then." Magnus grinned and scooped both his girls into his arms. At 2 years old, Hope was already showing signs of inheriting her father's size. She was taller and stronger than other children her age, but she had her mother's gentle heart and quick smile. Their ranch had grown into one of the most successful spreads in the territory. They now owned 300 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and had hired 4 steady ranch hands who treated Magnus and Magdalena with genuine respect. The Garrett family had sold their land and moved back east after Silas got thrown from his horse and broke his leg in 3 places. Some folks whispered it wasn't really an accident, but Magnus never confirmed or denied anything. "Papa, look!" Hope pointed toward the main road, where a familiar figure was riding toward them. It was Jacob Miller, the territorial judge who'd married them 2 winters ago. But he wasn't alone. A woman rode beside him, wearing a blue traveling dress and carrying herself like someone used to getting her own way. "Wonder what brings the judge out here," Magdalena said, shifting Hope to her other hip. "He looks serious." The woman with Judge Miller was younger than Magdalena expected, maybe 25, with yellow hair piled high and skin that had never seen a day of real work. When she dismounted, she moved, like someone uncomfortable in the saddle, like riding was something she did because she had to, not because she enjoyed it. "Magnus? Magdalena?" Judge Miller called out as he approached the porch. "I'd like you to meet Miss Victoria Ashford. She's come all the way from Boston with some interesting news about your family, Magnus." Magnus felt Magdalena's hand slip into his, and he squeezed gently. They'd learned to face surprises together, but something about this woman made him nervous. She studied him like he was a puzzle she needed to solve, and her green eyes held secrets. "Mr. Ironwood," Victoria said in a voice that sounded like expensive education and city manners, "I represent the estate of Colonel Henry Ironwood of Massachusetts. I believe he was your father." The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. His father had been a soldier who disappeared when Magnus was 8 years old. Magnus had always assumed the man was dead, killed in some forgotten battle or buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. "My father died years ago," Magnus said carefully. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victoria opened a leather case and pulled out several official-looking papers. "Colonel Ironwood died 6 months ago, but he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to find you. He left behind a considerable fortune, including land holdings in 3 states and mining interests in California." Magdalena's grip on Magnus's hand tightened. Hope babbled happily, unaware that her family's entire world might be about to change. "How much money are we talking about?" Judge Miller asked the question Magnus couldn't bring himself to voice. "Approximately $200,000, Victoria replied calmly, "plus the properties I mentioned. Mr. Ironwood, if you can prove your identity, you're a very wealthy man." Magnus felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. $200,000 was more money than existed in the entire territory, at least in his mind. It was enough to buy a dozen ranches, enough to never worry about drought or cattle prices or any of the 1,000 things that kept ranch families awake at night. But it was also enough to change everything about the life he'd built with Magdalena and Hope. "There's one condition," Victoria continued, and Magnus heard the trap closing. "The inheritance requires you to take up residence in Boston and manage your father's business interests there." The Colonel's will specifically states that the money cannot be claimed by someone living in what he called the savage territories. Magdalena's face went white. Boston meant leaving Montana, leaving the ranch they'd built together, leaving the only home Hope had ever known. It meant trading their simple, honest life for something complicated and unfamiliar. "How long do I have to decide?" Magnus asked. 30 days, Victoria replied. After that, the estate transfers to the Colonel's business partners. That night, after Victoria and the judge had ridden back to town, Magnus and Magdalena sat on their porch, watching the stars come out over Thunder Creek. Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, one tiny fist wrapped around her father's finger. $200,000, Magdalena said quietly. "That's more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes." "It's not our money," Magnus replied. "It's his money." The father who walked away and never looked back. But it could be Hope's future: college education, fine clothes, a life where she never has to worry about anything. Magnus looked at his wife, trying to read her expression in the dim starlight. What kind of life would it be if she had to leave everything that matters to get it? They talked until dawn, weighing possibilities against principles. The money would solve every practical problem they'd ever face, but it would cost them the independence and authenticity that had brought them together in the first place. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Magdalena said as the sun painted the mountains gold and purple. "That first morning when you told me you'd make me pregnant, you didn't offer me money or comfort or security. You offered me truth." Magnus nodded slowly. "And you said yes to the truth, not to any promises about easy living." When Victoria returned 3 weeks later for their answer, she found Magnus and Magdalena working side by side, repairing fence posts while Hope played in the dirt nearby. They looked up as she approached, and Victoria could see their decision in their faces before anyone spoke a word. "We're grateful for the offer," Magnus said, pulling off his work gloves. "But this is our home. This land, these mountains, this life we built together. It's worth more than any inheritance." Victoria nodded, like she'd expected this answer. "Your father thought you might say that. He left a second letter for me to give you if you refuse the money." She handed Magnus a sealed envelope, with his name written in handwriting he barely remembered. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only a few words. "I'm proud of the man you became, son. I hope you forgave me for leaving. Henry Ironwood." Magnus folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart. Some inheritances couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Some legacies were passed down through choices rather than money. As Victoria rode away toward whatever life waited for her back east, Magnus lifted Hope onto his shoulders and walked toward the house where Magdalena was starting dinner. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise and possibility. "No regrets?" Magdalena asked as they reached the porch. Magnus looked out over their land, their cattle, their simple but honest life, and shook his head. "The only thing I regret is that it took me 35 years to find you." Hope giggled and pulled on her father's hair, and somewhere in the distance, Thunder Creek sang its ancient song about water finding its way home through the longest, hardest journey imaginable.